Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I just want to welcome all of you to our session today with Gracia Grindal. Gracia, as some of you know, has an undergraduate degree from Augsburg College in Minneapolis, master's from the University of Arkansas, and then earned her master's degree in theology and history from Luther Seminary. She has taught in many places, including Luther College. She's got a very strong reputation as being a leader in hymnology in the Lutheran Church. And the best thing about Gracia, from my standpoint, she comes from the same part of North Dakota as we come from. She came from a little further west, but for many years lived in Rugby. And so she knows many of the names of people we have been visiting about. And so, Gracia, we're just pleased, so punched that you would be with us today. So go to it.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be with you. And if you have any questions, I'll try to be done so we can talk about them in 45 minutes. But I'm going to talk about Norwegian American Lutheran churches from really the beginning of 1843 till 1988, when the big merger of the Lutherans happened. And I'm going to stop by and look a little bit at Hans Nielsen Hauge, since he was so important to all of the immigrants who came over. So there are three basic trends when you think about Norwegian piety. It's Lutheran, but it's really developed into sort of the Low Church, which is the Hauge Synod, and the Middle Way, which is called the United, and the Norwegian Synod, which was Orthodox, and many people thought it was like the state church from Norway implanted here in America, and we'll talk about that as we move through. A little bit about Hans Nielsen Hauge. He was born near Sarpsborg. He grew up in a pious home, and his family was what they called landholders, rich farmers. There were three classes in Norway. Most of you know this, but they were people of condition or conditionert. They were the educated, often with Danish connections, or they grew up in Denmark and then came to serve in Norway. And then the rich farmers who had owned the land for many centuries. And then the husman, who were probably second or third or sixth brothers, who had no land, and they worked on the farm. Hauge's birthplace was near Sarpsborg in Tuna. This is his home. And if you go there to Norway at his time, if you travel back in time, you can see that religious education was required, and it was the same throughout all of Norway. And if you were a good, pious kid, you knew the Bible well, and then you studied the Catechism of Martin Luther with the explanation by Erik Pontoppidan, Forklaring. And many of us who were confirmed in the Norwegian Lutheran churches of the 50s, we used that catechism cut down very much. And the hymn book was the same, and they had many hymns that were Danish but became Norwegian because the Klokkers set them to Norwegian folk tunes. So there was a strong monoculture in Norway, and the immigrants to this country all came with those same resources. Now, Hauge, in April 5th, 1796, was out plowing in his father's field, and he had an experience that threw him to the ground. He was hit as though from light from heaven. He was unconscious for a bit, and he awoke a changed man. He came home dazed and finally wrote a book, and then he went to Oslo with it to see if he could get it printed. It was Meditations on the Folly of the World. It was really anti-clerical and against the dead clergy. The publisher was suspicious of him when he came, and he realized as he was talking to Hauge that he had the means to print the book, so he did. This was a really sharp critique, but as you know your history, the Enlightenment came, and it was very much interested in the Enlightenment that was very deistic. And so for catechization, they didn't ask you Martin Luther's thing. They asked you, for example, what color is the blood of fish? because you needed to know about creation. And so they preached that you should be good farmers because Jesus was born in a manger. And I've got this timer on wrong, I'm sorry. They recorded the vaccinations in the church books. It was science, enlightenment. Jesus was a good example. He wasn't necessarily divine. And the pastors were not considered spiritually alive by people like Hauge. So after that experience, he had a meeting.
Gracia, can I interrupt just very quickly? Please forgive me. Go back to the previous slide. Jesus was a good example, not necessarily divine. That was the state church, or was that Hauge?
That would no. That was the Enlightenment pastors.
The what pastors?
The pastors, Hauge's, the pastors in the Church of Norway at the time.
It was
No,
the
Hauge
Church of
who's
Norway.
it?
Hauge
Church
was
of Norway.
against that.
Okay,
Do
thank
you
you.
need the clicker? No. Okay.
Thank you.
Can you hear it at all?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, so at his first home meetings, he had a meeting in his home, and his father was there, and then they had a meeting in another home, and the pastor and the sheriff told them that they were breaking the conventicle law. Now, the conventicle law was written to keep the Moravians in place. They were a sect that came from Germany, and they started to have small group meetings, and the Church of Norway and Denmark and Sweden wrote what they call the conventicle law. You were not allowed to have small groups meeting together without benefit of the clergy. And so when he had his first meeting in Groenlandstua, they sang and read the Bible, and he preached, and the sheriff and pastors were there and said it was unlawful. And he asked them to read the conventicle law. And they thought the conventicle law is very, very complicated. And the
Unmute.
how did I get muted here?
There you go. Okay.
Yeah. He asked them to read the conventicle law, and as the people heard it, they said, there's nothing against what we're doing here. Okay, here, I see that. There's nothing against what we are doing, but you seem to prefer that we be drunken and not gather to hear the word and read it. This was an interesting meme to come out of this meeting. So this spread all over Norway that the church did not want us together for Bible study and preaching, and they want us not to change. And so the conventicle law, which forbade them, became the law they used against Hauge, even if it was unclear. He was thrown in jail in 1797, and he converted the soldiers, and the rumors about him began to grow, as always, against evangelists. But he continued walking through Norway, and he would say, we'll meet in the farm down the way, like Kividon. This is where my grandpa was born. And he would come early and help with farm chores and work in the kitchen. And then after he'd been there, he would write letters to all the people who had been there, and he had a huge correspondence. They would be read like Paul's letters in homes by the people as they gathered. So the small groups were the heart of the movement, and it was a young people's movement as well. People would follow him, and they would sing and ask questions. He traveled through southeast Norway, and then up to Bergen and Trondheim, and he began a business in Bergen, started a business there. Now, the state and church regarded him as a growing threat, so they would arrest him for vagrancy. People don't understand that today, but you could be arrested for being in the wrong county without permission. He was untrained, and they didn't like his theology, but Hauge said, that's what you teach us in the catechism. They went to church in the morning, but they met in homes in the evenings, and in some ways it's the beginning of what's called the prayer house, or the Bedehus. In 1800, he went further north, and he began establishing businesses like the Eicher paper mill. He would see people and places, and he would say, here would be a good paper mill, and you too should marry and run it. He was excellent on finding people and understanding them. Then he bought a ship for shipping his books north, and he entered into the north part of Norway. In Brunna and Vike Helgeland, my great-grandparents were one of his hosts, and one of my And my great-grandmother's great-grandmother, Ragnhild, became a preacher, like Hauge thought was just fine. And his accomplishments were to really Christianize Norway, spread the gospel deep down into the culture, and he freed it economically because it had been a mercantilistic system in which the government and business worked together with permits and regulations to keep private enterprise from going. And he started that with his brilliant understanding of where you put businesses and how you run them. He was very good not only at building businesses, but he knew how to pick leaders. And his leaders, he picked both men and women, and he allowed women to preach. And he was a very gifted matchmaker. So here are just some of the places where he found that could be built. You don't have to look at them all, but just see how extensive his travels were. He was arrested in 1804, and the bishop of Kristiansand, Peter Hansen, was an Enlightenment man, and he described Hauge as being like Wahhabi. And that scared the daylights out of the king and the church. So he returned and was arrested and thrown into a basement, and he lost his health immediately. He was given very strict treatment. The hearings started again in 1805, and he was let out to start salt works around because the Napoleonic Wars were still going on, and there was a blockade, and so Norway couldn't get salt. And he knew how to build them, so they let him out to 2 years of hard labor, and wasn't really in the prison after 1809 so much, but he was still under, they still had him in jail, so to speak. He was released in December 23rd, 1814. There's a touching picture of him in the prison window. He was very distraught. And some people came to yell at him up to his followers to see if they could get a response, because they didn't know if he was alive or dead. And he took the candle and held it to the window. So that became an emblem of Hauge's movement, this light in the candle in the window. He got out, paid a huge fine. He bought a farm. His wife died in childbirth, and he remarried. And he became one of Norway's richest men. He supported Grundtvig. In his last will and testament, he said, "Do not leave the church. Establish intermissions in Bedehus." He's buried in Gamla Åker. He was made fun of until 1848, his movement was. And then Tiedemann's painting, this one here, changed Norway and Norway's understanding of who Hauge was. As the immigration started, as you know, in 1825, but it really didn't get going until the 1830s. And then these immigrants built, there were so many of them, they could build a Norway in America, as one book has it. But they brought with them the movements from the Norwegian church. And in 1848, his movement was still being made fun of. But then when Tiedemann did this painting, which is considered one of the greatest paintings in Norway ever, they called him the Northern Raphael, Tiedemann. The Hauge movement was flourishing in kind of under the, where, you know, nobody saw it, but the common people were sharing it. And many people thought of it as kind of an underground, an open underground, with his small groups communicating, and it created the Norwegian peasant as a force. This is a better picture of it. And you see here, this, they didn't know, nobody knows what Hauge really looked like. This was supposed to be Hauge, but it's not. You see the people listening to him. They're not looking at him much, but he's preaching. There you have the old and you have the young, intent on hearing him talk. Here's a better enhanced picture of it. But this painting, as the latest scholar on Hauge says, changed Norway. It changed how Norwegians understood themselves. This was what it meant to be Norwegian, which is to be, wear the peasant customs and be a common person. There was a professor at the university named Gisle Jonsson, who was an Haugean intellectual, and he made Haugeanism acceptable to the people, upper classes. And most of the Norwegian pastors who came to America, like the Preußes and Horns and those people, they had been educated by Gisle Jonsson. and the founders of Augsburg too. Swerdrup and Oftedal had been educated by Jes Leonsen. So there was a real revival in Norway in 1850 that made an impression on people when they came to Norway. They said it's a very strange place. There's no carousing. It's quiet and holy. Now, so that's the background. The first man we know of that's in the history books, there was a pastor, Haugian lay pastor on the Restaurationen, but is Elling Eilson. Now, Elling Eilson came over in 39. He was a crusty old man. No one liked him. They said when he walked into a room, all the joy left it. But he decided he needed to be ordained. And so he was in October 3rd, 1843, because the Norwegians wouldn't quite accept only a layperson. They needed an ordained one. But he was fiercely Haugian. And he knew right away that the people needed to have catechisms like the Pontoppidan one I was talking about. So he walked to New York to get it printed. And the cane is in the Decorum Museum. He began to conflict immediately with the Norwegian Synod pastor Dietrichson, whom I'll talk about in a minute. Now here's where the Haugians were. This is Fox River. This is where it started. And that's where his center was for a while. Then he started what became the ELCA. Don't confuse it with what we have today. In fact, when the ELCA was founded, they had to ask this. There are about one or two congregations left if they could use the name. But it was the Eilson Synod is what it really was called. Here he moved then to Jefferson Prairie, which is on the edge between Wisconsin and Illinois. And they started building congregations in Chicago, and Elling Eilson's seminary, it was too big, it could not be sustained, but it was a big effort. But then they built the Red Wing Lutheran Seminary in 1876. President was President August Venus, and it trained the pastors for congregations like Westland. Now they believed in conversion, in low church, and in keeping apart from the world. They were against, they used the Norwegian liturgy, but they didn't want robes or chanting. That was what was specific to their tradition. They had to reorganize it because Eilson hadn't done a very good organization. As to how pietists, that's the kind of people that Hauge was. They don't organize very well. They want the spirit to move. But they do establish schools and missions. They were the first Norwegian Americans to send missionaries to China. I've written about that in my book, Tea Running. Austin Hansen was president of the Hauge Synod, and he was in Aspeland, Minnesota. As you know, here's the Ox Creek Hauge Synod Church. In 1917, when the merger came, there were 40,000 members, 120 pastors, and 389 congregations. It was largely rural, but it was the first, really, that came here with Elling Eilson. Then the Norwegian Synod came in really about 1843. The pastor, Johannes Christian Wilhelm Dietrichson, was at Koshkanon. Now he was, all these founders were crusty and kind of tough. They didn't compromise on anything. So Eilson and Dietrichson once had a big fight, and apparently Eilson took him by the beard and shook him and said, "You Pope, I'll fight you for the rest of my life." Now these people came from the elite in Norway, the pastors of the Norwegian Synod. They were university trained, and they were from this presteskap, they called it, these relationships. All of their kids married each other, so the pastor group in Norway is interrelated like you can't believe, and they brought it over here, and they were quick to establish an organization. He was very good at that, Dietrichson was, but he tried to exercise church discipline on a man who was drunk in the church, and he kicked him out, and the man sued him, and he won in court, which made the pastors a little nervous because they realized they couldn't exercise church discipline the way they had in Norway. And then a nice Danish man, Claus Lawrence Clausen, came to serve the Muskego congregation. He'd come as a teacher, and his friends in Norway had told him to come because they had connections with the Muskego church. But he was not ordained, and he realized very quickly he should be ordained as well. So he was ordained by a German pastor a little bit later than Eilson, and whether it was a kosher ordination was also a question for people who were leaders in the Norwegian Synod, but he was a sweet gentleman, Danish. Here's Muskego Church that was built at the time, and notice here, you have the pulpit above the altar. Preaching is more important than the sacrament, or the preaching is based on the sacrament. I don't know. You can read it a number of ways, but it's very important. And it happens in many churches in Scandinavia at the time that the pulpit is above the altar. And it's now on the Luther College, Luther Seminary campus. And I've had services in there, many sit and demise. And it's a wonderful place to be with all of its memories. Now, the real leader of the Norwegian Synod was Herman Amberg Preuss. He came to America in 1853 and 1851, and he was the president from 1853 until 94. And he always was in Spring Prairie, Wisconsin. He never left towards City Church or anything. And they said he was Orthodox to the tip of his fingers. He wasn't so much interested in how you felt about the gospel. He wanted you to think and believe the right way. That's what it means to be Orthodox. And he was he got to know the professors at Concordia Seminary in the Missouri Synod, and he was young and he was influenced by them and became very much a follower of their work. Now, their places are here in Dane County, and here's Muskego, Dane County, and that's kind of Norwegian Synod as it began. U.V. Koren, whose wife, Lenka Preuss, and Elizabeth Koren kept diaries of this time, and I've spent my life reading their letters and their diaries, but their husbands were really builders. He was also university trained. He was confessionally conservative. That means he wanted to follow the Augsburg Confessions, and like Preuss, and very conservative on that. He was pastor in Washington Prairie from 1853 to 1910. But he was the one who founded Luther College. He found the land and they bought it and built there. And so you have here is Luther College, and the Norwegian Synod sent it there. This is where the Haugians went in Iowa. The Korens arrived Christmas 1853, and his parish was called the Little Iowa Menighet congregation, and he would establish congregations all along the Minnesota-Iowa border. When I was at Luther College and would go visit churches, Koren had founded just many, many of them along the way. It's Washington Prairie where he was is still operating. It was once named one of the 10 best congregations in the United States in the Life magazine piece, and the story was told there. It's really a storied congregation. And they built the Luther College main building in 1865. And Norwegian Synod, they were Orthodox. This was an achievement. This was the largest building Norwegians had built west of the Mississippi. And they were quite proud of themselves. They got it done during the Civil War, and October 14th, 1865. They had a big celebration with, they say, 8,000 to 10,000 people there. Really proud of what they had done. And it was a pre-sem school. So it was kind of like a college, but it was a seminary prep school. And they sent their graduates to St. Louis Concordia Seminary to become theologically educated. They built their seminary in Madison in 1876. They moved it to Robbinsdale in 1888, and it burned down. and then they built one in Hamlin in St. Paul, and then moved to Luther, where I taught in 1917 at the big merger. Then there was the middle party, Scandinavian Augustana. It started with a group of Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians, and they were in Illinois. And Ole Paulson, the pastor, Trinity congregation, who was big in the Scandinavian Augustana Synod, which closed in 1870 when the Norwegians and Swedes broke apart. But this was a 10-year group, but they are the middle, you would say. And they were down in Paxton, down here, with their first school. And then the Swedes and Norwegians broke up, and the Norwegians went alone, and the Swedes began to establish what was Rock Island. And here's where the conference, the split became. Let me tell you about that. So they started two groups. The Norwegian group that broke off couldn't agree with each other. This is very common for Norwegians. So they broke up into the conference and the Augustana Synod, this Norwegian Augustana Synod. The leader of the conference was George Sverdrup, who was university trained with Gisle Jonsson. And he believed in free and living congregations. He believed that in America, the Lutheran Reformation could be lived out better than in Norway. He founded and built, or he made Augsburg Seminary his center. It was middle of the road. They were what we would call Orthodox Pietists, and Augsburg had a school for pastors that had an academy, college, and a seminary, and the pastors had to go to all of those. It was a 9-year school. They were Haugian from the Johnsonian revival. And so the conference, as it was called, became very important. It was quite big, and it was very aggressive as it was growing between 1870 and 1890. Here's a little bit, the Danish Augustana Synod. You maybe not have heard much of this, but it went to South Dakota. It was kind of the traveling school, and it took the name of Augustana because of the Swedish Augustana. It was the Norwegian Augustana College. And here are just some of their leaders. This is the president, and you can see where see how they go west. And right, Coon Prairie, Rushford, Highland, Minnesota. He was very gifted, and they went to South Dakota. Now, in North Dakota, every one of these movements came, as you can see, the Hauge, the Conference, and the Norwegian Synod. Those were the three groups going after 1890. And then, this is just a little historical fact. A group got angry at the Norwegian Synod for its rigid orthodoxy and left, and they became known as the Anti-Missourians, and they asked in 1887 the Norwegian Augustana Synod and the Norwegian Conference to join and start the United Church, which they did. It's very eerie because in 1980 something, the leader of the Seminex group that left Missouri asked the ELCA to be formed. He was at St. Olaf at the time. So it's kind of like history rhymes. The president of the United Church was German Hoyma. He was a pietist. He was raised in the conference, and he became the president of these three groups as they came together. He was a great preacher. He's Johann Hinderle's great-grandfather. He was a pastor in Eau Claire for most of his ministry. The United Lutheran Church Seminary was built in 1902. That's Luther Seminary now, but it was built by the United Church. Now, the United Church at 1917 had 280,000 some members, 1,800 congregations, and 556 pastors.
Gracia, may I just briefly interrupt?
Yeah.
I think you made some efforts to localize, and we let it pass the first time. You showed Ox Creek south of Rolette some time ago. I think this is Valley Church in Rolette, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you, Gracia, for bringing the local into their presentation. So keep
Yes,
going.
I want to do that even more here. So
Okay, keep going.
here, the Norwegian Synod. This is Vala here.
That's Val. Okay.
Yeah, the Norwegian Synod, the Luther College. That's how you remember it. Had 150,000 members, 355 pastors, and 1,000 some congregations. And then the Lutheran Free Church was very small. Didn't have more than 35,000 in 1930. It was run by Georg Sverdrup, and they left the United Church and started the Free Church in 1897. That's what I grew up in. I've just finished a book about my family and this tradition. So in 1917, there was this huge celebration. The Norwegians are together finally. And the Hauge Synod and the United Church and the Norwegian Synod merged, and they became one church. And there were thousands of people who gathered for that. They paraded through St. Paul, thrilled. They were thrilled by this. They had 1,000 pastors, almost 500,000 members, and 3,000 congregations. And the president of that church was Stub. He was the first pastor's son born, Norwegian Lutheran pastor's son born in America, 1849 at Muskego. And he was president of Luther Seminary, the ELC, which was the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America, and the pastor at Our Savior's and First Lutheran in Decorah. And they had their seminary at Hamlin in 1917, and they left it for Luther Seminary. The president of the ELC, which was called the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America until 1946, was Frederick Schutz. They merged in 1960, around 1960, with the Germans and the Danes, the first putting together of ethnic traditions. And then in 1988, the ELC, 2/3 of American Lutherans came together. And the LFC came into the ALC in 63. Now I just want to tell you a little bit about some of the pastors that were out in Rolette County. One of the pioneer pastors that I'm most interested in is Bernhard Hagbo. Notice where he was. He graduated from Augsburg in 72. They just moved to Minneapolis. And he was in these congregations in these cities. And he ended up semi-retired in Barton. He was called a walking preacher, and I'm looking Ox Creek Norwegian Evangelical Church here. This is Hagbo and his wife when he was still living. And then these are the pastors of that church, and I'll go through a little of that with you. But I knew Mrs. She became Mrs. Vong. She was living in Barton after Hagbo died. And she married Pastor Vong, who was one of the founding churches of the Rugby Tunbridge congregation. And so they would always come to Rugby to visit us. They were both 80, 90 something when they came. But that's Mrs. Hagbo Vong. And I knew her foster son, and his wife, Bertha, remember her, Bertha Hagbo? She died as almost 100 and something in Rugby. So here you have the Rolette County churches. These dots mean that they were closed, but you have Ox Creek, which is Hauge Synod, started in 1884, and then the Norwegian Synod, Island Lake, and it started in 1890, the Ox Creek Preaching Place, and that was 1885 to 1886. Willow Creek was Norwegian Synod. Wolf Creek, 1888. Now you'll be able to put those in. This means the United Church. The X's are United Church. The squares are Norwegian Synod, and the round ones are Hauge Synod. So here are the Hauge Synod churches. And here are the Norwegian Synod, and here are the United.
So this map is what year approximately?
1920 about.
Okay. The circle in the middle there, I think that's Vestland, isn't it? Yeah.
That one.
Right there. Yeah. Okay.
And as you have said, Paul, I was trying to find when it stopped at the 30s is all I could say.
Uh-huh, yeah.
And the Vala is Norwegian Synod. And this just kind of shows you from Norley's book, these places. Now, the red means they closed at that time.
Okay. You
The
got
Nansen was English, and that was United. FK means United,
okay.
for Inida.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And
Very
then
good, yeah.
there were 7 Haga congregations at that time, 9 Norwegian Synod, and 5 United. That's about right. The Norwegian Synod had longer to start, but there's closed also. So then here is Ox Creek Haga Church, and here are the pastors. And I'll do a little bit of history of them because I thought it was very interesting. Adriansen was an Augsburg Sam graduate, but then he moved to the Haga Synod. Must have been something that attracted him there. Then he went as a graduate to Botno, Greenbush, and he ended up in Idaho, where he died. Then you have Svingen. He was a coal porter. That means he sold tracts. He traveled around and preached in Norway. And he came to America in 1884 and went to Red Wing Seminary, the Haga Seminary. And then he came out and he served Ox Creek for about 3 years and Westland. Then he went to Randall, Iowa, which was a strong place for Haugianism in Iowa, Frost, and then Botno. What's interesting is many of these early pioneers, pastors, homesteaded, so they had land to retire on. This is an interesting guy, Bashvan Anderson. He was the first Haga pastor in the Red River Valley, and he was considered a circuit rider. And he would ride all over and start congregations and serve people. And he was briefly in Ox Creek Haga congregation, but he went to Canada. That was a very common move at the time. And so in Bardo, Alberta is where he ended up his ministry. But he was a character, kind of David Crockett of the Haga Synod. Langehaug is also pastor then in Ox Creek and Westland. And he was a leader in the Haga Synod. He became district president in 6 and 9. And then the Norwegian Synod Church, Vala, you had O.H. Oberg and T.S. Reichus especially. They're well known in the Norwegian Synod. Tunnison isn't so much. And then Eikenes, and he emigrated in 87, and he went to Luther Seminary, where you would go, and that was in Minneapolis and Robbinsdale. And then he came to Botno in 93, 97, then Willow City. And he was very highly educated, as all of the Synod pastors tended to be. Oberg is interesting. He went to Luther College and Concordia Seminary and Luther Seminary in Alexandria, Minnesota. He went walking up into Fort Totten, and he only found one white family there. And then a few years later, he found many. And he was pastor in Vala. And he founded an academy, kind of junior college in Grand Forks that became well known. And then back to the Haga. I've done the Norwegian Synod, the United, and the Haga. Ketil Torgerson Strand, he was a farmer in Norway, and he farmed in America. And then he retired in Rolette, really. He served in Westland, but he died serving Westland, and the congregation was vacant until 1937 when it was dropped from the parochial reports. He was a very gifted man as well, and many of you probably had parents and grandparents baptized and confirmed by him. This is an interesting note in the Botno Courant. Notice that they met with the president, I.D. Ilvasaker, district president, to consider the rearrangement of congregations and to make provisions for a pastor for the Botno church. What those provisions were, I cannot find, but at least there's some record that they realized they had to consolidate. At the end of one of every one of the annual reports of the church, of the ELC, there's a thing that says consolidated congregations, and Westlawn does not appear on those, but this was clearly what they were doing at the time. As I said, the pioneer pastors all homesteaded around there. Many of them homesteaded in North Dakota and stayed around. Here's Westlawn.
Yeah, you got that out of that big volume. I know.
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, I've gotten to know these congregations well here. So these three traditions endured, and they still do. There were many jokes made about them as they merged. The Hauge Synod people would talk about how the Norwegian Synod was too formal, and the Hauge Synod would make fun. I mean, the Norwegian Synod would make fun of the pietism of the Hauge Synod. There's one joke where a Norwegian Synod congregation called a Hauge Synod pastor, and he had them together for revival meetings and special meetings, which was very common among both the United Church and the Hauge Synod. And pardon my French here, but this Hauge Synod pastor called these people to evangelistic meetings every so often. And one time he tried to get them up to give testimonies for their faith. And this Norwegian Synod congregation didn't understand that. But finally he said to someone, Lars, I know that you're a Christian and you live close to the Lord. Can you talk about it? This is a Hauge Synod pastor now in the merged church talking to a Norwegian Synod man. And the farmer gets up and says, hems and haws, and he says, well, life with Jesus is good, and I guess without him, it's the shits. And that shows there's the two pieties right there in that. Or like Gerhard Furdy said once they got together to pray for rain, and his father, a Norwegian Synod pastor, was there. And the farmer looked at the pastors and said, there's no use to pray for rain, Pastor. The wind is coming from the other direction. So that's my
Okay.
lecture, and I'm open for questions.
That's terrific, just terrific, Gracia. Thank you so much for being so faithful to our request.
I had the fun doing it.
The global stuff, but getting absolutely local.
Yeah.
Just to add a little to the local, what's your insight as to what likely precipitated the Hauge Church Westland closing with its members going to the Lutheran Brethren and to the United Church?
Well, the Hauge members were always looking for Christians. One of the things they had this phrase, "Er du troende?" Are you a believer? And the Lutheran Brethren Church would have that, because to be a member of a Lutheran Brethren Church, you had to tell people that you were a saved person, that you'd had a conversion experience. So they would be attracted to that ultimately in a way they wouldn't be to the large, big church, especially the Norwegian Synod. And that would be where they would find a home. It's not quite the right place for them, but it's the closest they could find.
So it would have been common in most of the immigrant churches to have been like that as well, to have substantial numbers going one direction, substantial numbers going another direction.
No, and these congregations were also, you couldn't say, well, he's Hauge Synod, so he believes all these things, because every group became mixed with people who had to go to this church because it was where they lived and that sort of thing. So you could find very, very pietistic people in Norwegian Synod congregations and very Orthodox people in Hauge Synod congregations. So they would spread out, and the Lutheran Brethren Church would be attractive to many of the Haugeans for that reason.
Good. All right. Thank you. Let's open it up. Questions from any of you?
Yeah, I had a question.
Go ahead.
In your slideshow, you showed that at one point they all merged. What precipitated that merge after they had all kind of segregated out based on their different levels of different types of belief systems? What caused them all to merge all of a sudden?
Well, they considered it would be a good thing to get the Norwegians together. So it was their Norwegianness that brought them together, and the Norwegian evangel, that's what they were. And so these three strains lived on very well in the ELCA. It was a wonderful church body. because the Haugians were busy doing mission and revivals, and the Norwegian Synod was always doing theology. And so you have the Preußes and the Furties and those people that are the teachers of the church. And then you have the Haugians who are the missionaries. And then the United Church was rich and they could build. So St. Olaf College is their place. So they had these three kind of very different DNAs that went together well in the ELC, and it was their Norwegianness that brought them together.
Were other denominations and churches doing a similar thing? Was it a kind of a phase of grouping during that time, or was it just unique to the Norwegian group?
It was especially unique to the Norwegians at this time, but in the 1950s, everybody was merging.
Mm.
And it was considered a scandal if you didn't merge. And I grew up in that. The Free Church was against merging because they had left in a rage. And they used all this language about Jesus praying that they might be one in John 17. Well, actually, he wasn't praying for the merger of the ELCA. He was praying that we would be one in Christ. So, but they did get together because it was time for the Norwegians to get together and maximize their effect. I think that would be the way we would say it. But they were very Haugian. Even the Norwegian Synod had been there. And here's a secret. If you know the current church, when I was working with people as we were getting ready to merge with the ELCA, I was shunned. They had to have me on things, but I was a Haugian. And the Haugian emphasis has never been understood by other Lutherans. Norwegians understand it. But the Swedish Augustana, their people who were like the Haugians left and formed the Covenant Church. But when I was on this study for the Task Force of Ministry with the ELCA, they were just really mean to me because of my Haugian background. The church. I didn't understand the church. I was too a Protestant. I was individualistic. They had all these words against me. I was anti-Catholic anyway. But that Haugian piece we should be proud of it. They're starting to understand Haugi better in Norway. And we laugh at them for being legalistic and all that sort of stuff. His followers were more legalistic than he was. He had a still and served wine. He was against dancing, but he wasn't against drinking. So it's been a misunderstanding of Hauge, and now they're finally starting to do really interesting scholarship. There's a new book out that's changing everybody's mind now, and I've reflected that in my speech.
Additional questions?
Well, at the time that Hauge was active in Norway, there was a lot of intolerance toward him. But as I understand it, in Norway, eventually there got to be much more tolerance of dissenters and of people who had differing views.
Right. They took away the conventicle law in the 1840s. And so then they could have Methodists and, they could have different faiths. But Hauge, because of that painting, Hauge became much more respectable in the 50s. And even though some intellectuals didn't like him later, Haugianism really sort of defined what Norwegians were in a way. And it's hard to explain that, but the intellectuals in Norway who are anti-church don't believe that. But Hauge, you have to deal with him if you're going to talk about Norway and Norwegians in America.
Questions?
Paul,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
This is Chuck.
Yeah, Chuck.
A question relative to the location of Rolette to the reservation. Just wondering if when the settlers arrived, let's say the late 1800s and early 1900s, did they have contact with the tribe members relative to bringing Christianity to them, or perhaps already the tribe was well into it, so to speak.
Well, the Episcopalians did much more work in that regard, but Beresfond went there and to Fort Totten, and he saw the Indians there, but he also then said there wasn't place for ministry for me. And then he came back a couple of years later, and there were many more Norwegian settlers there. So I think they didn't think, I mean, in a way that was kind of tribal. These people aren't in our tribe. Episcopalians weren't that way. And so they had a much more open mission work with the Indians. There was in Wisconsin, there was a orphanage for Native Americans, but from what I could tell, they thought, well, that's not our tribe. I may be wrong about that, but that's my understanding.
Gracia, is it appropriate to introduce here based on Chuck's question, the fact that the French
Right.
have been a great history with the natives, and
Right.
being the Catholic Church was a fairly common thing, and
Right.
and so that maybe the Lutherans said, "What the heck? We'll stay away," because the Catholics got the early stage there.
Right. That's also probably true. The Catholics and Episcopalians had really strong missions to the Native Americans.
Yes.
And the French, the voyageurs, that was a really strong culture from the north. So
Yeah, good point. Okay, additional questions. These are all very good. Keep it
Do
up.
we know something about the tendency of Norwegian immigrants in the 1880s and later to join non-Lutheran churches in
Yes.
North Dakota, for instance?
Well, we don't know so much there. The English church that I pointed out, what was that its name again? Nunson. That was an attempt by the Norwegians to keep those people who wanted to join the Episcopal Church, was where many of them looked if they were liturgical, but they became Methodist. They were 3 out of 10. Let's see, 7 out of 10. It's a high number of Norwegians stayed in the Lutheran Church. The Swedes, it was 3 out of 10. But then when they got into the churches, they fought. As I've said, these 3 different kind of movements in it. But there was not all Norwegians joined any church, and many of them joined American churches because they were Americans now, and there's this thing that a lot of people in America don't understand. Out of the 30 Years' War in Germany, they developed the thing that the religion of the prince is your religion. So in England, for example, when the Germans came over to the Hanover, that's Queen Elizabeth's family, they became Anglican, and then everyone in England had been Anglican, and the kings and queens had to be Anglican. But in America, there was many of the Lutherans in the East believed that their king, they were Germans, and their king had come from Hanover, but then he changed to Anglican in England, and so Muhlenberg's grandson became an Episcopal priest because you join the church that the head of the culture, the prince, believed. Something like that. There's the Landeskirche and your religion and the prince are very strong. So you don't retain the old religion, you become new. So you become Methodist or whatever. Sorry, that's a confusing answer. But
Further questions? Arne Estebo, our good friend from Norway, has been on and been silent all afternoon. Arne, do you have anything to offer?
No, I don't think so.
Well, tell us about the religious activity at Gilja today at Dirdal. What's the affiliation? Where do people attend? Are they mostly Lutheran? Do they go to different places? What's it like?
Yeah, they are Lutheran, and they go to the most of them go to bedehus.
Uh-huh.
Not so many go to the state church.
Not so many to the state church. Okay.
They use the state church for funerals and weddings and confirmation and so on. But on a daily basis, it's bedehus who
Okay.
is the church.
The community, it's the community center in effect, is it?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Right.
Additional comments, questions by anybody?
Yes, can you just tell me again what year the Hauge Church merged with the other two?
They all merged in 1917.
1917, and then they became the,
1917.
and the new name was the,
Norwegian Lutheran Church in America, but they changed it to ELC in 1946.
ELC in 1946. Okay, thank you.
I had a couple of questions, Paul.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bernie.
One's right on your topic, and the second one's a little more personal because of some of your experiences that you've mentioned.
Yeah.
The first one is, we just assume, of course, that at least in the 1800s, the services were all, because these were Norwegian churches, were all conducted, in Norwegian. At what point would those churches have, where they were starting maybe to have the services in English, or when maybe they, that was the more common language during the service?
Well, the number of churches that had services in Norwegian and in English was equal in 1924, 50% each. I mean, this language lasted a lot longer than we think, but there were efforts to anglicize the worship. And so there were 2 books done by the United Church and the Norwegian Synod of English hymns in 1898 and 1895. And that hymnal, a new hymnal that they put together then with the Hauge Synod, United Church and Norwegian Synod, became the Lutheran Hymnary in 1912. But that was in English. But they were still publishing Norwegian hymnals for 1916, the Concordia was half Norwegian, half English. So it took a long time. But anyway, the efforts, there was an English group in the church, through the teens. But it took a long time, and World War I really hastened that, because then it was unpatriotic to speak another language.
Well, also you had the children of the pioneers now.
Right. But it was what's really interesting is you could live, like my mother grew up in Cyrus, Minnesota. She couldn't speak a word of English when she got to grade school, because it was all Norwegian. The church, the family, everything was Norwegian. So the kids didn't learn Norwegian. If they lived in the city or had more contact with other cultures, then they would. But it's a little surprising when you look at it. My dad, when he went to rugby, preached 50% in Norwegian in the Tunbridge and Berwick, not in rugby.
The second question was more personal, because you mentioned Luther Seminary. Now, I don't know if that's the one in St. Paul or not.
Yes.
Okay, then I'm guessing you are familiar with Gerhard Ferde and Jim Nestingen.
Very well. I knew them very well.
Okay, well, I'd like to follow up with you later, because we in our church, they've had a big influence. And I've read several of their books.
Right. Gerhard Ferde's father was the pastor in the neighboring church to my mother's in Cyrus, in Starbuck. And that was always Ferde's church.
Yeah,
and
you mentioned the name Ferde, so that must be a connection there.
Oh, yeah. He was Norwegian Synod, and Nestingen was kind of in that combination as well. But those strands at Luther Seminary it was by agreement when it merged. It contained all of the former seminaries of the Norwegian Church, Augsburg, Luther and United, and Red Hauge. And they always had to hire people from each side of the fight. So it was a rich and contentious group, because we represented these different traditions and we learned how to fight about them. And actually, it made us very smart.
Yeah, good, good. Yeah, I'll talk to you more about that later.
Mhm.
This is a fascinating discussion, folks. Let's keep it going. Anybody want to have a question? Susan, you've been quiet out on the West Coast. What do you have to say from Washington this afternoon?
Hi, Paul.
Hi.
I joined late. We're down in Walla Walla at a campground. So, yeah, it's very interesting. I'll have to tune into the first half of it since I joined late, but I know that my mother and her family were a little bit, they had the sentiment that the Hauge Lutheran Church carried some, I think, some negative consequences in that with the legalism piece, I believe is what they were referring to. I know my Uncle Walter used to, Wally used to mention that from time to time, and my mother too. They were kind of a little bit, they had a little difficult time with some of that, having been, when they got to Chicago, they ended up in a Hauge Lutheran church too, and they felt that there was a lot of condemnation, I think, upon them, placed upon them from that Hauge piece. I don't know if it was the particular pastor they were under. It seems when they were in Chicago.
Many people, even today, you meet who think that Hauge ruined their lives because he wouldn't let them drink or dance or play cards. It wasn't Hauge, it was legalism. But
yeah.
My dad grew up in Ferndale, Washington, in a free church, and the Hauge movement was very strong on the West Coast. It wasn't large, but it was very powerful. And so the legalism of dancing, drinking, smoking, and playing cards there's nothing in the Bible against that, but it's a wonderful idea that I think we should bring back. It's around the law. The Jews, that's a Jewish notion. You don't even ever say the name of God, so that keeps you from ever misusing it.
I see.
So you put a fence around the law. There's nothing against dancing. It's what it leads to. And getting a girl pregnant back then ruined her life.
Right.
And so it was good, but I argued more about dancing in Luther League than about Jesus, and that was kind of a waste. But it did have its, it was, you can't pass on a spiritual movement in the same way you can an organization. You can't make your kids be converted, and that, so that you just have to expect it or hope that it happens. And so it became, for the people who didn't have the Spirit in the first experience, it became rigid legalism to be, they ruined my childhood. So
Can I ask, you have a family member that grew up in Ferndale. Can I ask what their name was?
My dad's name Grindal. He grew up there.
Grindal. Oh, right. Okay. Right. Okay. My dad spent a lot of time in Ferndale. His parents were from there too.
My dad his mother died when he was born. He was originally a Kivli.
Oh.
Grindals.
Oh, I've heard
And
that
their
name.
brother something. They were Lutheran brethren. But he lived next door to his real father, who couldn't take care of him, of course, because he was born without a mother, essentially.
Yeah.
But we know the Kivlis very well in Norway. We're very close to them. And my dad was very close to his family, too. So.
Okay. And your dad's first name again was?
What?
Your father's first name again was?
Harold Grindal.
Harold. Okay. Thank you.
Jeffrey Epping, any questions for us?
No, I don't have any questions. I enjoyed it though.
Okay, thank you very much. Dick Coons. Dick is my neighbor here in Orchard Path, and he just loves to listen in. So Dick, have you got a question today?
No, I'm sorry, I don't. Very
okay. All right. Well, I must say this has been just a very fact-filled session, and we are in debt to you, Gracia, for this time you spent to put this together for us. I think just at the end, you should share with us the names of your recent book or books that would be most enlightening to this group here.
Well, I've written 3 books sort of on both traditions. The Hauge one is on Thea Running, and it's Augsburg Fortress will sell them. And that's on the Hauge Synod in America as it developed for this woman who came over to be a missionary in China, of all things. And then on Sister Elizabeth Fedje, that's the United Church. And then I did the Norwegian Synod Unstoppable, which is about how the Norwegian Synod came to educate its daughters, because it had this men's school and then it built this girls' school, and then coeducation came. So there are three that will tell you about this. And then someday my book on the Free Church will maybe see the light.
Okay, thank you. And we will be preparing the recording and send that around. And just a terrific session today. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Let's say thank you to Gracia and call it an afternoon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
I enjoyed